History is not an isolated event. It is today.
People have to understand how significant the AME Church was.
We've been going through these kinds of occurrences, it seems, almost every 3 months.
A deadly assault inside an historic AME church leads to a renewed debate over the Confederate flag. This is part 2 of our special edition of Clemson News Now on Holy Ground, Massacre in Charleston. Dylan Roof is accused of killing 9 worshipers after sitting with them during a Wednesday night Bible study at Emmanuel AME Church. Roof was arrested the next day in North Carolina and brought back to Charleston. His first court appearance is October 23rd. One issue back in the spotlight is the Confederate flag flying at the State House in Columbia. Governor Nikki Haley wants it to come down. Senator Lindsey Graham and other leaders echoed Haley. Dr. Vernon Burton is on the set with us now to talk more about the history of the South, the Confederate flag, and the power of symbols. Thank you so much for joining us. But before we get to that, hate led to the deaths of 9 people and the shooting of a 10th person. The victims welcomed their killer to join them for Bible study. Vernon, we spoke to Dr. Abel Bartley about the AME Church and why it's so common for African Americans to receive people of all races into their church houses.
People have to understand how significant the AME Church was. When Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and those other men came together and created the African Methodist Episcopal Church, what they were doing was they created the first independent black denomination in the history of Christendom in 1816. So you had something, for the first time, African Americans were saying, we're going to run a church. In the African American tradition, the church was, that's why they called it Mother Bethel. Mother Bethel was one of the first churches in Philadelphia with the AME Church and others. It was a place where everybody was welcome, and the notion of family in the African American community is an expansive notion because of the history of slavery and also the history in Africa where a family was basically a clan, everybody who was related to you. And so for the church, for African Americans, they really bought into this notion of brotherhood. And it's not based on color or race or anything, it's a brotherhood. And if you come to the church, then the church's responsibility is to help you. And so, it was the whites that put restrictions on who could come to their church. African Americans always had an open door policy.
Do you have anything to add to Dr. Bartley's comments, Dr. Vernon?
I think that Abel was absolutely right and did an excellent job. I will say that I wrote about this in my first book, In My Father's House of Many Mansions, the centrality of religion to blacks and whites. And I do think that there's something very significant about the African American church and theology, that its focus is very much the New Testament. In fact, if you go through the former slave narratives, those WPA projects, interviews of individuals who had been enslaved, they often in fact call the Bible that little book of John's, and the reference to John, which emphasized the idea of community and particularly the idea of redemption and love and forgiveness and inclusiveness in terms of community. White theology, particularly before the Civil War, and I think a lot of it has continued. White Protestant theology in the South has looked to the Old Testament God of law, and particularly sometimes a God of vengeance, maybe justice, but certainly there's a difference there that has always been, I think, part of black and white Christians. Yet there's also common ground, and I see some hopeful signs there that particularly the response of the African American victims' families and the community hopefully will show how the extraordinary power of faith can be in people's lives to ask for forgiveness for other people.
Speak to us a little bit about the South and its history as it applies to hate crimes and things of that nature, or just our misunderstanding of each other as human beings.
Well, I think you have a good question. It would take a lot of time, but let me just try to deal with something first. I think it is so important that we look at this. This is one of those iconic times. It's an incredibly historic moment that South Carolina is looking seriously at the Confederate flag again. I hate to think that it is because of this massacre, but it is that people are rethinking what all of this means. I think you cannot see the incident in Charleston as an isolated incident. There are 2 ways. One, we think of 9/11 and the beginning of terrorism, but African Americans have lived in a terroristic state since involvement in slavery, and then after at least till 1965 in the Voting Rights Act, without access to the law in a meaningful way or even a meaningful vote in times. So it's not isolated. Secondly, the church itself has been the target of violence and vigilantism and terrorism over the years. Mother Emanuel itself, of course, was in fact razed, burned down after the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy. Rebuild, we can go through Reconstruction. You see that churches were the target again and again of the Ku Klux Klan, the terrorism. Even in 1990, you might remember the Justice Department did an investigation of the burning of black churches, particularly in rural areas. And I was somewhat heartened back at that time to see white Christians coming together with African American Christians to rebuild those churches. And probably the one that most people are familiar with, but it is not an isolated incident, of course, is the Birmingham bombings that killed the 4 little girls in 1963. So the church is a significant part of the African American community, plays such a central role. It was there too that a lot of education, which many white supremacists object to, was seen as central. It was certainly during what we call the first Reconstruction, that is after the Civil War, why so many of the black churches were burned or attacked.
Now, South Carolina, just like any other state, has its monuments, its statues, its flags as symbols that represent what the state or states are all about. Of course, the one that's rearing its head again, as you mentioned, is the Confederate flag. We took it down from the dome in 2000, am I correct? It was
That's right.
the year
There's
2000.
a compromise that we're tied to now, and you're going to hear more and more about this compromise because out of it came the Heritage Act. It's going to take 2/3 of the legislators to bring it down. Although I'm not an attorney, don't pretend to be, but I can't see why one legislature's rule that be 2/3 can bind another one to change it back. But still, that's what it says at this time.
Why does it take something like this at this time before an election year for some of our leaders to step out and speak on this issue of the Confederate flag and what it means?
Well, let me back up just a little bit. I think it's wonderful that we're revisiting, and hopefully the flag will be removed from the public State House ground where African Americans are paying taxes to support it when it has such a meaning. The flag itself means different things to different groups of people. We've seen this. And I think that certainly by now, many whites for a long time, I think, did not realize what the flag meant to African Americans. And I can give you a good specific example that I was part of it. I was part of a civil rights group in college called the Southern Student Organizing Committee. And the Smithsonian called me years ago trying to find out what is this silly symbol we have found. We had a button flag, and what it was a black and white hand grasping, shaking hands across the Confederate flag. So as late as 67, 68, I'm not sure many people understood that while the Confederate flag was sort of identified with the South, that it also, for so many African Americans, represented oppression and also the resistance to the civil rights movement and equality. But today, I don't see how anyone cannot know that this flag means that to a significant population in South Carolina, 1/3 of the state. And South Carolina was a majority black state until 1940, which a lot of people have forgotten over time. It's important for us to remember, too, that people don't learn their history from the books historians write. If they did, my grandchildren have a lot better education funds if they read The Age of Lincoln or some of the other books. But they learn their history from what we tell people in the public history, in the public square, and no place more important than the State House ground. What is important? And look at the South Carolina State House ground. Now, part of the compromise of getting the flag down in 2000 2000 was the erection of a really moving and beautiful memorial to African Americans. Not an individual, though. If you know your history, you might recognize that probably the individual who's in robes there is Judge Matthew Perry. You know that Ronald McNair was an astronaut, but there's no one named. And while it's a moving monument, that's not the same thing. Look at who the monuments are to on the State House ground. They are important figures in our history. But Wade Hampton, who was a Civil War general, owned so many slaves, is one of the wealthiest men in the world, and who was the person who was elected in the overthrow of an interracial, legitimately elected government in 1876. We had, in fact, a coup d'etat in South Carolina. Then you have, of course, Pitchfork Ben Tillman, Governor Tillman, who was influential in the building of Clemson and the destruction of Clemson. And again, Tillman means different things to different people, as does Hampton. Tillman did a lot of good things, education for white people, for better democracy for white people in terms of representation, prohibition. He was a leading progressive reformer, but at the same time, he is the prototype, and most historians point him out, of the Southern white demagogue, in fact, who led in the disfranchisement and the call of white supremacy and segregation. So he means different things to different people. Then you have James F. Burns, who in fact is one of the most talented politicians of all time, almost became president. You know, here's a little Irishman from South Carolina. His father dies young, doesn't even finish high school. He goes to Congress, becomes known as a Cardinal Richelieu of the Senate. He becomes, in fact, the Supreme Court Justice. Franklin Delano Roosevelt asked him to be the domestic president of the United States and run the United States domestically pretty much, while FDR is focusing on World War II. And then he becomes Secretary of State, and he comes back to South Carolina, though, for the state he loves, because he opposes integration and fights integration and supports segregation. And then you have Strom Thurmond, a man who, again, is one of the most talented politician to ever live and has done so many good things for the state of South Carolina, but who is remembered for opposing in 1957, of course, a voting rights bill, and then again in 64 opposing the Civil Rights Act 65, but primarily from 1948, when the Dixiecrat Party was formed in response to Harry Truman's forming a Civil Rights Commission and integrating the armed forces. And it is Strom Thurmond who is the candidate of the Dixiecrats, running on a strong policy of segregation and appropriating that battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia, which is not the Confederate flag, but the Army of Northern, it's Robert E. Lee's flag. And I used to give a little lecture and a PowerPoint and went around and showed all the monuments. I said, there's not a single African American called out by name on our State House ground. I've had to change that, because Strom Thurmond's family actually added Strom Thurmond's African American daughter, which I think is a wonderful thing for them to have done. But it even makes the point larger that there's not an African American, or for that matter, there are whites who went against the grain and stood for racial justice over the years in South Carolina. And I won't say that these are necessarily heroes, but they are the role models. We are saying to people, if you want a statue built to you, here's what you do. And I think it's important that we recognize some of the people. I mean, we have so many that you could build statues to who've done incredible things who are African Americans in this state on the State House ground. South Carolina is sort of known for two things, starting the Civil War, but most people don't know that it was a group of rural African Americans in rural Clarendon, South Carolina, that most of them lost everything, have never got the sort of rewards or the recognition for starting what became known as Brown v. Board. As Briggs v. Elliott was the court case that Thurgood Marshall argued at the Supreme Court. Probably would have been named, in fact, Briggs v. Elliott instead of Brown, but for political reasons, we're not quite sure. And yet, we do not recognize these people, and that is what led not only to integration, but later on the Civil Rights Act and all the other rights that we now see. So you can see it's not just the Confederate flag. The Confederate flag is a manifestation of a culture in which we have celebrated opposition to African American rights, whether it's white supremacy or whatever. All of the individuals that we have recognized, no matter what good, and most of them did extraordinary good things for this state and for whites, but they have stood in opposition to black rights. Many people were not aware that the flag, particularly those of heritage groups who honestly believed that this is part of their heritage, didn't realize that it could also be appropriated to the extreme of white supremacy. If nothing else, the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, Vietnam should teach us that you do not convince people to do otherwise by calling them racist or telling them they're morally wrong. But we have to get past where we're not talking to each other and engage each other in conversations. There's another thing that goes, I think, with the culture of the South, along with this idea of supporting, if not white supremacy, certainly commemorating people who have supported white supremacy and things, and that is the South with slavery was different. Now, slavery was a national phenomenon. It finally got focused in the South as it was dying out in the North and other areas. But slavery required either violence or the threat of violence, or you could not have made people be slaves. If we could lead the nation, and I've seen some hopes of that. I see the people in Charleston, the people of South Carolina stand up. If we to a better place of understanding. I heard A.D. Carson's talk, and I agree so much. You cannot sweep your history under the rug because you're going to trip over it. History is not an isolated event. It is today. You are here because of what happened before, and you come out of that, and your culture grows out of that, and your cultural landmarks, those signals, those signifiers, like the Confederate flag, have special meanings. They can mean different things to different people. One of my heroes is Harvey Gantt, the man who first integrated the public schools in South Carolina, right here at Clemson in 1963, heroically challenging segregation in South Carolina. And he said that you can appeal to the morals of a South Carolinian, but you can appeal to his manners. That's right. And I would like to think that people, if they understand that this flag is insulting, hurts other people's feelings, do they really want to hold it at the State House ground and celebrate it there? I would like for them not to do it anywhere, but I understand people have a right to express themselves in their own home and other places, but certainly this is not something who people, particularly African Americans, are paying their taxes, should be supporting if it has the horrible meanings of segregation, third, fourth class citizenship, and even slavery.
And we do appreciate you coming in for this episode of Clemson News Now. I'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Vernon Burton and A.D. Carson, for their insight and their information. We leave you now with more of Clemson's tribute to the victims killed on holy ground, Massacre in Charleston.